January 26, 1945. A frozen battlefield near the French village of Holtzwihr. Snow fell quietly on the wreckage of war, but the silence would soon be broken by thunderous gunfire. Here, on the edge of the Colmar Pocket, a single American soldier was about to make history. His name, Audie Murphy, just 19 years old, a boy from Texas with no formal military training beyond what the Army had given him, was about to hold off 250 German soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. Alone, for over an hour. January 26, 1945. The world was at war, and Europe lay shattered under the weight of armies, tanks, and the bitter cold of winter. In the small French village of Holtzwihr, smoke drifted over snow-covered fields, and the air reeked of gunpowder, mud, and fear. This was the Colmar Pocket, one of the last strongholds of Nazi Germany in Alsace. Here, exhausted American soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division faced the fury of Hitler's best-trained mountain troops, supported by armor. The German plan was bold, ruthless, and simple: break through the thin American line, reclaim lost ground, and drive the Allies back. But history would not remember this battle for its grand strategy or its shifting front lines. It would remember it for one young man. A 19-year-old Texan, small in stature, quiet in voice, yet larger than life in courage. His name was Audie Leon Murphy, and on this frozen morning, he was about to step into legend. Setting the stage, the 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting without rest. Snow blanketed the ground, turning supply lines into a nightmare. Ammunition was low, soldiers were exhausted, and reinforcements were scarce. The Germans, however, were determined. They had launched a ferocious counterattack to hold on to Alsace. On January 26th, they struck the line near Holtzwihr with overwhelming force, 250 soldiers and 6 tanks. Against them stood fewer than 40 Americans of Company B, battered, cold, and nearly out of ammunition. When the order came to pull back, most obeyed. But one man refused to leave. Audie Murphy stayed. Who was Audie Murphy? To understand why Murphy chose to stand when everyone else retreated, we must go back. Back to the dusty fields of North Texas, where a boy was born in 1925 into poverty so deep it seemed unescapable. Audie was the 7th of 12 children. His father was absent more often than not, and his mother struggled to keep the family alive. Audie grew up working fields, chopping cotton, and hunting rabbits with a borrowed rifle to feed his siblings. Life was harsh, but hardship forged resilience. It was in those woods and fields that Murphy learned to shoot with uncanny accuracy. He had no formal education beyond the 5th grade, but he had something rarer: discipline, toughness, and a will to survive. When his father abandoned the family for good, and his mother died when Audie was just a teenager, responsibility fell on his young shoulders. He was now not just a boy, but the provider, a soldier born of necessity. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Audie was only 16, too young to enlist, but he tried anyway. First the Marines, then the Navy, then the paratroopers. All rejected him. He was too small, too thin, too young. But Murphy refused to give up. Finally, at 17, with his sister's help forging a document to add a year to his age, he was accepted into the United States Army. At just 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing barely 112 pounds, he hardly looked like a soldier. But what he lacked in size, he made up for in tenacity. His drill sergeants quickly discovered what Audie Murphy was made of. He could outshoot, outlast, and outfight men twice his size. He never complained, never quit. And soon, he was shipped overseas, to the inferno of war. Baptism by fire. Murphy's first taste of combat came in North Africa in 1943. It was brutal, chaotic, and merciless. From Africa, he went to Sicily, then Italy, slogging through mud, mountains, and relentless enemy fire. In each campaign, Murphy stood out. Not because he sought glory, he despised it, but because again and again, he refused to back down. By 1944, during the invasion of southern France, Murphy's reputation was sealed. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross for single-handedly destroying a German machine gun nest and capturing its crew. He earned the Silver Star, twice, for heroism under fire. His fellow soldiers began to whisper, "Murphy's charmed. Bullets don't touch him." But Murphy wasn't charmed. He was simply relentless. The winter of 1945, By January 1945, the war was nearing its climax, but the fighting was fiercer than ever. Hitler had unleashed his last desperate gamble in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies had pushed him back, but in Alsace, the Germans still held ground. Here, the Colmar Pocket had to be eliminated if France was to be fully liberated. And so, in freezing temperatures, with snow waist-deep and supplies thin, the 3rd Infantry Division advanced. Murphy, now a lieutenant, commanded a platoon of weary, battle-hardened men. They trusted him completely. He had earned that trust not by rank, but by action. He always led from the front. He never asked his men to do what he would not do himself. On the morning of January 26th, as German forces massed outside Holtzwihr, Murphy's company was ordered to hold the line at all costs. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary stands in the history of warfare. The German assault. The attack began with artillery. Shells rained down, shattering trees, tearing craters in the frozen ground. Then, through the smoke, German infantry advanced, hundreds of them, supported by tanks rumbling forward like iron monsters. Company B had barely 40 men, stretched thin across a shallow line. Ammunition was running low. Radios crackled with desperate calls for reinforcements that would never arrive. Murphy surveyed the field and knew the truth. They could not hold. Not as a unit. If they stayed, they would be slaughtered. And so, he gave the order. Pull back. But he himself did not move. Alone against an army. What went through his mind at that moment? Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps instinct. Perhaps the sheer refusal of a boy who had fought his whole life against impossible odds. Whatever the reason, Audie Murphy stood alone. He watched as his men retreated into the woods for cover, leaving behind a burning M10 tank destroyer, its crew evacuated, flames licking at its hull. German tanks were advancing, infantry spreading across the field. Murphy climbed onto the wreckage. Smoke choked the air. Beneath his feet was an engine that could explode at any second. And in his hands, an M2.50 caliber machine gun. Then he opened fire. The first burst. The gun roared, spewing fire and tracers into the ranks of advancing Germans. Enemy soldiers, expecting a collapsed line, suddenly found themselves under withering fire from a single point. Murphy's aim was deadly. Years of hunting rabbits in Texas had taught him precision. Now, each burst cut down attackers by the dozen. Germans fell left and right, their advance stalled by one man's fury. Behind him, Murphy grabbed the radio and called for artillery. His voice was calm, steady. "This is Company B. They're right on top of us. Fire for effect. Drop it on my position." The incredulous operator replied. "That's your position." Murphy snapped back. "That's right. Bring it in. The closer, the better." Moments later, American artillery exploded across the field, tearing through German ranks. Still, Murphy kept firing, alone against hundreds. Minutes turned into an hour. For over an hour, Audie Murphy held his ground. Bullets whipped past. Shrapnel tore into his legs. The tank beneath him burned hotter, threatening to detonate. But he did not move. Eyewitnesses later said it seemed impossible. He was everywhere at once, one recalled. It looked like an entire company was firing, but it was only Murphy. By the time his ammunition ran out, Murphy had killed or wounded at least 50 enemy soldiers. The Germans, shocked and demoralized, began to withdraw. Their assault had been broken, not by a battalion, not by a company, but by a single man. And as they fled, Murphy climbed down, limping, exhausted, his clothes burned and bloodied. He gathered what remained of his men and led a counterattack, driving the enemy from Holtzwihr. Before the battlefield, before the medals, before the headlines that would one day call him America's most decorated soldier, Audie Leon Murphy was just a boy, a poor, skinny boy from Texas, a boy who knew hunger, abandonment, and loss long before he ever knew the taste of glory. The harsh land of Texas. Audie was born in 1925 in a sharecropper's shack near Kingston, Hunt County, Texas. It was not the Texas of wide ranches and cowboy legends, but one of dirt farms, back-breaking labor, and endless poverty. The Murphys were a large family, 12 children in all. Too many mouths to feed, too little money to go around. His father, Emmett Murphy, drifted in and out of the family's life. Sometimes he would leave for weeks, months, and return empty-handed. His mother, Josie, carried the true weight of survival, working herself into exhaustion to keep her children alive. The Great Depression loomed over everything. Crops failed, money was worthless, and every day was a struggle. For Audie, childhood was not filled with toys, games, or carefree afternoons. It was defined by labor. From the moment he could walk, he was working, hoeing rows of cotton, hauling water, chopping firewood. His small hands blistered, his back ached, but there was no choice. This was survival. A boy with a rifle. But there was one place Audie found a strange kind of freedom, in the fields and woods with a rifle. He was barely tall enough to shoulder it, but necessity made him a marksman. Rabbits, squirrels, birds, anything that could be caught or shot meant dinner for the family. Ammunition was scarce, so every bullet mattered. One missed shot meant one less meal. And so, Audie learned to fire with precision. He could drop a rabbit on the run, pick off a bird from a tree branch, hit a target at distances that stunned grown men. Years later, fellow soldiers would marvel at his accuracy under fire. But for Audie, it wasn't talent, it was training. Not on a range, but in the school of poverty. His rifle was not just a tool. It was survival, pride, and responsibility wrapped in cold steel. Loss and hardship. If hardship builds resilience, then loss carves character. And Audie Murphy knew loss well. His father eventually abandoned the family for good, disappearing into the wind, leaving Josie alone with her 12 children. Audie was devastated, but he buried his feelings deep. Then came a heavier blow. In 1941, Josie, the one anchor in Audie's turbulent life, died of pneumonia and exhaustion. She was only in her 40s. Audie was just 16. And suddenly, the boy was no longer a boy. He was the head of a broken family. The younger children were sent to relatives and orphanages. Audie, left to fend for himself, carried guilt like a shadow. He felt he had failed them, failed her, failed to keep the family together. That guilt never truly left him. Not in the war, not in Hollywood, not even when medals clinked across his chest. Dreams of a uniform. But America was at war now. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Men were lining up to enlist. And Audie, with nothing left tying him to Texas, wanted in. He was drawn not by patriotism alone, but by something deeper. The Army offered escape, purpose, a steady paycheck, maybe even honor. There was just one problem. Audie was 16, underweight, and too young. When he first stepped into a recruiter's office, the Marine Corps laughed him out the door. The Navy shook their heads. The paratroopers, men who prized toughness, dismissed him immediately. "You're too small, kid. Go home." But Murphy didn't go home. He kept trying. He lied about his age, insisted he was 18. Finally, with the help of his sister, who falsified his birth date on official documents, Audie Murphy was accepted into the United States Army in 1942. At 17, he had made it. The scrawny Texas farm boy was now a soldier. Training camp. The Army tried to break him, and found it couldn't. At Camp Walters in Texas, and later at Fort Meade in Maryland, recruits were pushed to their limits. Long marches, grueling drills, endless push-ups, punishing discipline. Most men cursed, complained, or broke down. Murphy did none of these things. He was silent, determined, and relentless. Though small, he was wiry. His endurance was unmatched. He could run farther, march longer, shoot straighter than most. The same toughness that had kept him alive in Texas now made him a natural soldier. Drill instructors noted his grit, but still doubted his future. Some whispered he was too boyish to ever lead men, too small to make a difference. They were wrong. Sent overseas. In early 1943, Murphy was shipped overseas. First came North Africa, his baptism by fire. The desert was unforgiving. Sandstorms, heat, and confusion reigned. Murphy's unit saw little combat here, but it was enough to introduce him to the chaos of war. From Africa, the 3rd Infantry Division moved to Sicily. Here, Murphy faced combat head-on. German troops, hardened and disciplined, fought fiercely. The young Texan quickly proved himself. He showed courage under fire, a cool head in chaos, and an uncanny instinct for survival. His superiors noticed. By 1944, during the brutal campaign in Italy, Murphy's legend began to grow. He wasn't reckless, he was precise. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others faltered, he pushed forward. It was as if every hardship of his childhood had prepared him for this. The hunger, the pain, the loneliness. All of it had forged him into a soldier who simply would not quit. Brotherhood in battle. For all his individual heroism, Murphy was never a lone wolf. He loved his men, the ordinary soldiers who fought, bled, and died beside him. He knew their names, their fears, their jokes. He shared their rations, their cigarettes, their sleepless nights in foxholes. He protected them with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. Murphy would fight like a madman if his men were in danger, one comrade recalled. He wasn't fighting for medals. He was fighting for us. That bond of brotherhood defined Murphy. It explained why, on that January morning in Holtzwihr, he refused to retreat when his men pulled back. To him, their lives mattered more than his own. A rising star. By late 1944, Murphy had already collected a chest full of medals. Bronze Star, Silver Stars, Distinguished Service Cross. He was wounded, promoted, and hardened by endless combat. But he never sought recognition. In fact, he hated it. He shrugged off praise, insisting he was just doing his job. To the army, he was becoming a symbol. To his men, he was a lifeline. To himself, he was just a boy trying to survive another day. Yet destiny was closing in. The Colmar Pocket awaited. The village of Holtzwihr awaited. And the moment that would etch his name into history was drawing closer with each passing day. Voiceover pause. The making of Audie Murphy was not forged in training camps or on battlefields alone. It was forged in the fields of Texas, in the grip of poverty, in the sting of loss, and in the unshakable will to keep moving forward. And now, with Europe in flames and the German war machine still clawing for survival, all of that would be tested in fire and steel. The boy who grew up hunting rabbits with a borrowed rifle was about to face tanks with a machine gun. War tests men in ways nothing else can. Some falter, some break, and some, like Audie Murphy, are sharpened into steel. By the summer of 1943, Murphy's 3rd Infantry Division was thrown into Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. This was no training ground, no drill sergeant screaming in the heat of Texas. This was war, and it was merciless. First Blood, Sicily, 1943. The landings on Sicily were chaos. Artillery thundered across the beaches, tracer fires slashed the night, and German and Italian defenders poured everything they had into stopping the Allied advance. For most young soldiers, the first taste of combat is overwhelming. Fear can paralyze. Noise, smoke, and death create a madness few can endure. But Audie Murphy did not flinch. He advanced steadily, rifle in hand, his sharp eyes scanning, his instincts guiding him. On patrols through rocky hills and villages, he demonstrated uncanny calm. His marksmanship, honed on rabbits and squirrels back in Texas, was lethal. Enemies who thought they had the drop on his squad often fell before they even fired a shot. Comrades began to whisper, "Murphy's not like the rest of us. He doesn't miss." It was in Sicily that Murphy first proved he wasn't just another soldier. He was something more, something rare. Italy, the bloody boot. From Sicily, the 3rd Infantry pushed into mainland Italy. Here, the fighting became brutal. Towns reduced to rubble. Muddy foxholes filled with water and rats. Endless artillery barges that tore men apart in seconds. In September 1943, during the landings at Salerno, Murphy again showed extraordinary courage. German forces counterattacked ferociously, throwing waves of infantry and armor at the beaches. Many Allied troops panicked. But not Murphy. He calmly took position, fired with precision, and held his ground while others scrambled for cover. Later, in Anzio, the nightmare grew worse. For 4 months, Allied troops were pinned down on a narrow beachhead. Artillery pounded them day and night. There was no escape, no safety, only survival. Murphy endured it all. No sleep, no comfort, just the constant threat of death. Yet even here, his leadership began to shine. He was still barely 19, yet men twice his age looked to him for courage. He never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. If there was a dangerous patrol, Murphy volunteered. If a machine gun needed to be silenced, he was the first to crawl forward. He was fearless, but not reckless. Always calculating, always focused. One fellow soldier recalled, "When Murphy was with you, you felt safer." It was like he could see danger before it happened. The Silver Star. Italy was where Murphy earned his first major decorations. One incident in particular stood out. During a firefight near the Volturno River, His company was pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. Soldiers hugged the dirt, terrified to move. Then Murphy acted. He crawled forward, belly to the mud, inch by inch, until he reached a position close to the gun nest. With perfect timing, he hurled grenades, silencing the threat and saving his platoon. For this, he received the Silver Star for gallantry in action. It was the first of many. But to Murphy, medals meant little. What mattered were the men who survived because of his actions. The French Riviera, Operation Dragoon. By August 1944, the Allies launched a second invasion of France, not on the beaches of Normandy, but along the southern coast in Operation Dragoon. Here, Murphy's legend grew even larger. During the advance inland, he and his best friend, Private Laddie Tipton, came under heavy German fire. Together, they led a counterattack, capturing or killing enemy troops and seizing vital ground. But then tragedy struck. Tipton, the closest friend Murphy had in the war, was killed right beside him. The loss shattered Murphy. He had seen men die before, but this was different. This was family. Grief turned to fury. Fueled by rage, Murphy stormed forward, killing Germans with cold precision, refusing to stop until the position was secure. Later he admitted, "I just lost all control of myself. I didn't care anymore." That day, Audie Murphy crossed a line. He was no longer just fighting to win battles. He was fighting with a personal fire that nothing could extinguish. For his actions in France, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest award for valor. Wounds of war. But heroism came at a cost. In October 1944, during the brutal fighting near the Vosges Mountains, Murphy was hit by shrapnel in the hip. He could have asked to be evacuated, but he refused. He stayed with his men, limping through the forests, bandaged but unbroken. Later, malaria racked his body, leaving him weak and feverish. Still, he fought. It seemed nothing, not bullets, not explosions, not illness, could keep him from the front. Reputation among the ranks. By now, Murphy was more than a soldier. He was a legend among the 3rd Infantry Division. New recruits whispered his name in foxholes. "Murphy's in B Company. You'll be all right if he's around." Even officers who had doubted him at first now respected him deeply. They knew that if Murphy was in the fight, there was hope. German soldiers, too, began to fear him. Captured prisoners spoke of a small American with the eyes of a hunter, who always seemed to appear where the fighting was fiercest. Murphy wasn't a giant. He wasn't covered in muscles. He wasn't even loud or commanding. He was quiet, watchful, and relentless, the kind of man who simply refused to die. A soldier transformed. From Sicily to southern France, Audie Murphy had been transformed. He had entered the war as a scrawny boy desperate to prove himself. Now, he was a seasoned warrior, hardened by fire, scarred by loss, but respected beyond measure. And yet, his greatest test was still ahead. The Colmar Pocket. The frozen fields of Holtzwihr. A moment when one man would hold back an army. Everything he had endured, the hunger, the abandonment, the battles, had led to this. And soon, the world would watch in awe as Audie Murphy etched his name into history with fire and steel. By the winter of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. But like a dying animal, it was most dangerous in its final moments. In the frozen fields of Alsace, along the Rhine River, the German army launched desperate counterattacks to hold back the Allies. The region became known as the Colmar Pocket, a bitter, bloody battlefield where American and French forces struggled against cold, exhaustion, and an enemy determined to fight to the last man. And it was here that Audie Murphy's destiny awaited him. The Colmar Pocket. The Colmar Pocket was Germany's last foothold on French soil. It stretched across villages, forests, and snow-choked fields. Hitler demanded it be held at all costs. The Germans threw everything they had into the fight, battle-hardened infantry, tanks, artillery. Despite their dwindling resources, they fought ferociously, knowing that retreat meant surrender. For the Allies, clearing the pocket was essential. The Rhine River was the gateway into Germany itself. Until the Colmar Pocket was eliminated, the road to final victory was blocked. The fighting was vicious. Bitter cold gnawed at the men as much as bullets and shells. Snowdrifts swallowed tanks. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Soldiers shivered in foxholes, unable to light fires for fear of snipers. It was war at its most merciless. B Company moves in. Murphy's unit, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, was thrown into the heart of it. By January 1945, Murphy was a seasoned veteran with countless battles behind him. He was also a first lieutenant now, a leader of men who trusted him with their lives. His company was ordered to defend the village of Holtzwihr, a small cluster of houses and farmland surrounded by snow-covered woods. It was strategically vital. If the Germans broke through here, they could drive a wedge between Allied units and prolong the war. For Murphy and his men, the orders were clear. Hold Holtzwihr, at any cost. The men beside him. Murphy's company was worn down. Weeks of constant fighting had reduced their numbers. Supplies were thin, morale even thinner. Many soldiers were replacements, fresh faces with no experience in the kind of brutal combat that lay ahead. But they had Murphy, and to these weary men, that meant everything. They had seen him charge enemy positions alone. They had seen him drag wounded men to safety under fire. They had seen him fight with a ferocity that defied belief. When Murphy said, "We'll hold," they believed him. The German threat. The enemy they faced was no small raiding party. Intelligence reports spoke of an imminent assault by a German battalion, roughly 250 men supported by tanks and artillery. These were not scattered defenders, but seasoned mountain troops, trained for exactly this kind of winter warfare. For a company already depleted, the odds were impossible. And yet, they dug in. Foxholes were carved into frozen earth. Machine guns were placed in defensive positions. Ammunition was stacked, though there was never enough. Every man knew what was coming. Murphy's state of mind. By now, Murphy was only 19 years old, but he had lived a lifetime of war. He had buried his mother, lost his father, and seen his best friend die in his arms. He had fought across Sicily, Italy, and France. He had medals pinned to his chest and scars across his body. But none of that mattered here. What mattered was the 40-odd men who looked to him for leadership. Murphy was quiet as the snow fell around their positions. He studied the fields before them, the line of trees where the enemy would come from, the terrain that could be used to their advantage. He was calm, focused, ready. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he didn't know it yet. The calm before the storm. The morning of January 26, 1945, dawned cold and gray. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling sound. Breath hung in the air like smoke. In the distance, the low rumble of engines broke the silence. Then the sharp crack of artillery. German shells began to whistle overhead, exploding among the trees and houses of Holtzwihr. The assault had begun. Murphy ordered his men into position. The younger soldiers trembled, rifles clutched tight. Veterans tightened their helmets, muttered quick prayers, and waited. The ground shook. Tanks were coming. Through the haze of smoke and falling snow, dark shapes emerged. German infantry, columns of them. Behind them, the hulking silhouettes of 6 tanks, steel beasts with cannons that could level buildings. It was the nightmare every infantryman dreaded. Hold your ground. Murphy's voice cut through the chaos. Hold your ground. Aim low. Make every shot count. His words were steady, calm, almost casual. To his men, it was like a lifeline. If Murphy wasn't panicking, neither would they. Machine guns opened fire. Rifles cracked. The fields erupted in battle. Germans fell, but more kept coming, advancing relentlessly. The tanks rolled forward, their turrets spitting fire. Explosions ripped through the American defenses. Snow and dirt rained down. Men screamed, bled, and died. Murphy moved through it all, directing fire, shouting orders, keeping the line together. His presence was magnetic. Wherever he stood, the defense held. But it was clear, the Germans had numbers. They had armor. And sooner or later, Company B would be overrun. Decision at the edge. It was in that moment, when retreat seemed inevitable, that Murphy made a choice. A choice that would define him forever. He ordered his men to fall back into the woods for cover, to regroup and avoid annihilation. Reluctantly, they obeyed. But Murphy did not move. Instead, he climbed onto the wreck of a burning M10 tank destroyer that had been abandoned in the field. Flames licked its hull. Ammunition inside threatened to explode at any second. Any sane man would have run. But Audie Murphy wasn't any man. He grabbed the mounted .50 caliber machine gun, swung it toward the advancing enemy, and opened fire. One man against 250. A boy from Texas against the German army. and for over an hour, he held them back. January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. The world around Audie Murphy was fire and ice. Snowflakes fell silently through the smoke of burning vehicles. Explosions shook the frozen earth. German voices shouted through the woods as tanks growled forward, their turrets turning hungrily toward the village. Company B had fallen back, scattered into the trees. But Murphy remained, a single figure standing atop a burning M10 tank destroyer, flames licking at its hull, ready to detonate at any moment. In his hands, the .50 caliber Browning machine gun. In his heart, the unshakable will to stand. One man against hundreds. The German assault force advanced relentlessly. 250 soldiers, 6 tanks, mortars, machine guns. Against them, one 19-year-old Texan. Murphy braced himself behind the smoking wreckage and opened fire. The .50 caliber roared like thunder, its tracers slicing through the snow-filled air. Germans crumpled in the fields. Whole squads dove for cover. The advance faltered, not because of an army, but because of a boy with a machine gun. He fired until the barrel smoked. Fired until the belt-fed ammo rattled down to its last rounds. Every shot counted. Every burst dropped enemies who thought victory was within reach. The hour of fire. For over an hour, Murphy held. An hour that felt like eternity. Bullets snapped past him, ricocheting off steel. Mortar shells exploded nearby, showering him with dirt and shrapnel. A tank swung its turret and fired, blasting chunks from the ground around the M10. But still he stood. Still he fired. His radio crackled as he called artillery down, on his own position. "Drop it right here," he ordered. The incredulous voice on the other end asked. "Right on top of you." Murphy's reply was cold, steady. "Right on top of me. There are more of them than there are of us." Moments later, American artillery rained down, smashing into German ranks. Men screamed. The battlefield erupted in chaos. Yet Murphy did not stop firing, even as shells exploded so close they scorched his clothes. Flames and fury. The M10 beneath him burned hotter. Flames licked at his boots. Ammunition inside could explode at any second. Any sane man would have leapt off and run. But Murphy was beyond sanity, beyond fear. He was fury embodied. Every bullet he fired was for his men sheltering in the woods. Every burst was for his mother, who had died too young. Every tracer round was for Laddie Tipton, his best friend who had fallen in France. He was not just holding the line. He was making a stand against death itself. The German shock. On the German side, disbelief spread. Reports later showed how stunned they were. How could one man, alone, defy them so completely? They tried to flank him. Murphy cut them down. They tried to advance in groups. He mowed them down. Even tanks, massive beasts of steel, hesitated under his storm of fire. What should have been a swift breakthrough turned into a nightmare. German commanders shouted orders. Soldiers hesitated. Morale cracked. The unstoppable assault stopped. Wounded, but unbroken. Then it happened. A piece of mortar shrapnel tore into Murphy's leg. Blood stained the snow at his feet. Pain seared through him. But he refused to stop. He wrapped his wound with a bandage, propped himself higher on the burning wreck, and kept firing. Wounded, bleeding, standing on a bomb about to ignite, Murphy continued the fight alone. The turning point. Finally, after over an hour of defiance, Murphy's ammunition ran dry. The smoking barrel fell silent. The German advance had stalled. Dozens of their dead and wounded littered the fields. Murphy climbed down from the flaming tank destroyer. Any other soldier would have collapsed, begged for evacuation. But not Murphy. He limped back to his men in the woods, rallied them, and ordered a counterattack. Inspired by what they had just witnessed, the company surged forward. Together, they drove the Germans from Holtzwihr. The village was saved. The line held. And it had all begun with one man's refusal to break. Silence after the storm. When the guns finally fell silent, the snow continued to drift down, covering the broken bodies across the field. The wrecked M10 still burned, smoke curling into the gray sky. Murphy stood there, exhausted, wounded, his uniform scorched and bloody. But he was alive. And so were his men. One soldier later said, "We didn't believe what we were seeing." He held off the whole damn German army by himself. The Medal of Honor. For his actions at Holtzwihr, Audie Murphy would receive the Medal of Honor. the highest award for valor the United States can bestow. The citation read, Second Lieutenant Murphy's directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. His indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction. But medals could never capture what really happened that day. Because Holtzwihr was not just about courage. It was about defiance in the face of the impossible. It was about one man deciding that surrender was not an option. It was about a 19-year-old boy from Texas standing alone against the weight of war and winning. The smoke of Holtzwihr still clung to Audie Murphy's memory. He had stood alone, fought the impossible fight, and emerged victorious. But war was not finished with him. Winter was giving way to spring in 1945, and the Allies pushed deeper into Germany. Hitler's Reich was collapsing, yet every mile was still paid in blood. A living legend among soldiers. When Murphy returned to his company after Holtzwihr, he was no longer just Lieutenant Murphy. He was a legend in flesh and blood. Men who had seen him fight with their own eyes whispered his name with awe. Survivors swore they'd never forget the sight of that boy on the burning tank, holding back an army. But Murphy himself? He remained quiet, reserved, almost embarrassed by the attention. To him, Holtzwihr wasn't glory. It was survival. It was duty. And it was loss. Because every time he thought of his Medal of Honor, he thought of the men who weren't there to share it. The push into Germany. The spring offensive was brutal. Town by town, village by village, Murphy and his comrades fought their way across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. The landscape of war had changed. The once mighty Wehrmacht was a shadow of itself, reduced to desperate conscripts and fanatical SS units. But desperation made them dangerous. Ambushes still killed. Snipers still waited. Mine still took limbs. For Murphy, every day was another test. And yet, even after Holtzwihr, he never allowed himself to slow down. He led patrols, charged machine gun nests, and refused to ask anything of his men that he would not do himself. Recognition from above. By now, word of Murphy's deeds had spread beyond the battlefield. Reports of the boy soldier who had destroyed tanks, led charges, and fought entire companies alone reached the ears of generals and even the public back home. Newspapers ran stories calling him the one-man army. Fellow officers recommended him for award after award. By war's end, Murphy had become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, 3 Purple Hearts, and more than 30 other medals and foreign decorations. No American soldier had ever worn so much steel and ribbon across his chest. But beneath the medals, Murphy remained the same slight, soft-spoken young man from Texas, haunted, humble, and wary of what all this hero talk meant for him. The weight of command. With every victory, Murphy carried a heavier burden. At 19, he commanded men older than himself. Farmers, mechanics, teachers, fathers. They looked to him for decisions in moments where hesitation meant death. And every order weighed on him. Every time he told a squad to advance, he knew some might not return. The nightmares had already begun. At night, he saw faces of friends like Laddie Tipton, whose laughter he still remembered. He saw burning villages. He saw eyes staring blankly from bodies sprawled in the mud. Murphy had not chosen to become a soldier, but the war had forced him into a role he could never walk away from. Germany's fall. By April 1945, Hitler's empire crumbled. Cities lay in ruins. Columns of surrendering German troops marched into Allied lines by the thousands. And then came the most haunting discoveries, the concentration camps. When Murphy first saw Dachau, he was shaken to his core. He had fought the Nazis on battlefields. But here was the real face of their evil: starved prisoners, skeletal bodies, stacks of the dead. It was a sight that no amount of battlefield courage could prepare him for. A sight that seared itself into his memory forever. The enemy he had killed in countless firefights was suddenly revealed not just as a soldier, but as part of a regime capable of industrialized murder. The end of the war. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For the world, it was a day of celebration. For soldiers like Murphy, it was a day of quiet disbelief. After years of marching, fighting, bleeding, suddenly it was done. No more attacks to prepare for. No more orders coming down the chain. No more Germans across the river. Murphy, barely 20 years old, stood at the end of it all as one of the greatest warriors the U.S. Army had ever seen. Homecoming dreams. But victory came with questions. Who was he now? A boy who had dropped out of school at 5th grade? A poor farm kid who had once hunted rabbits just to feed his siblings? The Army had given him purpose. But with peace, that purpose was gone. And as the guns fell silent, another battle was waiting. The fight to find meaning beyond war. The inner battle. Even before he set foot back in America, Murphy felt it. A restlessness, a darkness, a constant replay of images from the front lines. He could not sleep without dreaming of battle. He could not hear fireworks without flinching. He could not sit still without feeling the itch to patrol, to scan the horizon for threats. The war might have ended. But inside Audie Murphy, it had only just begun. The war was over. Europe was free. The guns were silent. For Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of World War II, victory should have meant peace. But peace was a stranger to him. At just 20 years old, Murphy had already lived through more than most men ever would. He had led men into battle, held off hundreds alone, and survived wounds and nightmares that left him scarred inside and out. Now, he was returning to a country that saw him not as a young man with troubles, but as a living legend. Homecoming to a hero's welcome. When Murphy arrived back in America, newspapers blared his name. Photographers chased him. Parade organizers wanted him front and center. This skinny, shy Texas farm boy suddenly found himself America's poster child for victory. Everywhere he went, people reached out to shake his hand. They wanted to see the boy who had faced tanks alone, the baby-faced warrior, who wore more medals than anyone else. But inside, Murphy felt out of place. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like the man on the posters. He still felt like the poor kid from Hunt County who had gone to war because there was nowhere else to go. Hollywood comes calling. It wasn't long before Murphy's story reached beyond Texas. Hollywood noticed. Star actor James Cagney heard of Murphy's exploits and invited him to California. At first, Murphy resisted. He had no training, no acting skills, no plans beyond finding a quiet life. But America had fallen in love with him. Offers came for book deals, speaking tours, appearances. Soon enough, Murphy found himself on studio lots, surrounded by cameras and scripts. He was awkward at first, his soft Texas drawl and quiet manner clashing with Hollywood polish. But there was something about him, an authenticity that no actor could fake. This wasn't a man pretending to be a soldier. This was a man who had lived it. To Hell and Back. In 1949, Murphy published his memoir, To Hell and Back. It was raw, honest, painful. Murphy wrote not to glorify war, but to tell the truth. He didn't shy away from describing the fear, the loss, the dirt, the screams in the night. The book became a bestseller. Readers devoured it, struck by how this national hero stripped away the myth and showed the human cost of battle. Then, in 1955, Hollywood made it into a film. And who better to play Audie Murphy than Audie Murphy himself? When To Hell and Back premiered, audiences were stunned. There on the screen was not some actor, but the actual man who had fought those battles. The film shattered box office records for Universal Pictures. For 20 years, it remained the studio's highest-grossing film, until Jaws came along in 1975. But for Murphy, playing himself was no easy task. Reliving those battles on camera reopened wounds he had tried to bury. Every gunshot, every explosion on set brought memories rushing back. What the audience saw as thrilling war cinema, Murphy experienced as a return to the front. Fame and fortune, Hollywood embraced him. Over the next 2 decades, Murphy starred in more than 40 films, mostly westerns. He became the archetype of the quiet, steely-eyed gunslinger, the cowboy who stood tall against impossible odds, much like the soldier who had stood alone in France. Audiences loved him. Studios profited. But while Murphy smiled for cameras, signed autographs, and lived in the spotlight, a darker reality lingered behind closed doors. The silent enemy, PTSD. Back then, there was no term like post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it battle fatigue, or shell shock. For Murphy, it was sleepless nights. It was waking in cold sweats, reaching for a pistol at the sound of a door creak. It was throwing himself to the ground when fireworks went off. At night, he saw the faces of the men he had lost. He heard the screams of the wounded. He relived Holtzwihr again and again. The burning tank, the charging Germans, the machine gun rattling in his hands. His fame made it worse. Everyone wanted a piece of him, but no one wanted to hear about the nightmares. To cope, Murphy began sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He grew restless, edgy, prone to sudden bursts of anger. In public, he was the war hero. In private, he was a man still at war with himself. Courage beyond the battlefield. But Murphy refused to hide from the truth. Unlike many veterans of his time, he spoke openly about his struggles. He testified before Congress about the needs of soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD. He argued for better mental health care, for understanding, for compassion. At a time when most men buried their pain in silence, Murphy's willingness to confront his demons in public was another act of courage. He knew the war would never leave him. But if he could use his fame to help others, then maybe it was worth it. The man behind the medals. Through all the fame, Murphy never changed at his core. He still sent money home to his family. He still carried himself with humility, often embarrassed by talk of his medals. He still considered himself just a farm boy who had been thrown into extraordinary circumstances. Friends said that Murphy never boasted of his deeds. He rarely spoke of Holtzwihr unless pressed. And when he did, he downplayed it, always quick to mention the men who didn't make it back. To him, the real heroes were the ones who never returned. Shadows of the past. But fame could not silence the shadows. Murphy's gambling habits grew. His marriages strained. He often disappeared for days, chasing solitude or escape. He lived with the tension of being two men at once. Audie Murphy, the American legend, adored by millions. And Audie Murphy, the soldier still trapped in the war, fighting ghosts no one else could see. The battlefield had made him immortal, but peace reminded him that he was human, fragile, wounded, and forever changed. Fame had come. Hollywood had embraced him. But Audie Murphy was never truly at peace. Behind the sharp suits, the movie posters, and the smiling photographs lay a man who still lived in 1945, on the frozen fields of France, in the craters of Italy, in the haunted silence of the Colmar Pocket. The war was over for the world. But for Audie Murphy, it raged on. A life divided. By the 1960s, Murphy was both one of the most famous veterans in America and one of its most private. He had starred in more than 40 films. He had made money, lost it, and made it again. He had shaken hands with presidents, stood before Congress, and appeared in magazines. And yet, when the cameras were off, he returned to a life of solitude. He gambled heavily, sometimes recklessly. He withdrew from friends for long stretches. At night, the battlefield returned. Gunfire. Explosions. The faces of the dead. He kept a pistol under his pillow, unable to sleep otherwise. Some nights, he paced the house, too restless to lie down. The man who had once stood on a burning tank, fearless in the face of death, now fought enemies only he could see, speaking for the silent. But Murphy never forgot his fellow soldiers. He used his platform to speak out for veterans when few others would. At a time when terms like post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist, he described his nightmares openly. He admitted to the anxiety, the rage, the sleepless nights. He told Congress that America's veterans deserved better care, that the war did not end for them when the shooting stopped. His honesty gave voice to thousands of men who had suffered in silence. To them, Murphy wasn't just a war hero. He was proof that even the strongest among them carried scars. Financial struggles. For all his fame, Murphy's finances were often precarious. Hollywood roles began to slow in the 1960s. The Western, once America's favorite genre, was fading. He invested in businesses. Some failed, some succeeded. He raised horses, tried real estate, even explored songwriting. But money came and went quickly, often drained by gambling or poor investments. And yet, through it all, Murphy never chased luxury. He wasn't a man of mansions or sports cars. He lived simply, sometimes frugally, sending much of what he earned to family and charities. The wealthiest thing he carried was his name. But even that, he sometimes wished he could put down. A private man. Those who knew Murphy best described him as soft-spoken, polite, sometimes painfully shy. He avoided large crowds when he could. He disliked speaking about his war record, often brushing it off with humor or deflection. To strangers, he was the Medal of Honor recipient, the Hollywood cowboy. To his close friends, he was simply Audie, a man still searching for peace. The tragic flight. On May 28, 1971, Murphy boarded a small private plane bound for Virginia. The weather turned foul, thick fog, poor visibility. The plane never reached its destination. Near Brush Mountain in Roanoke County, Virginia, the aircraft crashed. All 6 men aboard, including Audie Murphy, were killed instantly. America had lost its most decorated soldier. He was just 46 years old. A nation mourns. News of Murphy's death stunned the country. Veterans wept. Hollywood grieved. Politicians praised his service, his courage, his sacrifice. When he was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, his grave quickly became one of the most visited in the nation. More than 2,000 mourners attended the funeral. Soldiers stood at attention. Bugles played. And beneath the gentle Virginia earth, Audie Murphy was laid among the very men he had fought beside. His headstone, by his own request, was modest, smaller than most, without the full list of his decorations. For even in death, Murphy wanted no special treatment. He had always said the real heroes were the ones who never came home. Now, at last, he lay among them. The legacy of Audie Murphy. More than half a century later, Audie Murphy's name still resonates. He remains a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, of the quiet power of one man's determination. His story reminds us that war is not just medals and parades, but wounds that never heal, battles that never end. Murphy showed the world what courage looks like under fire. But he also showed what courage looks like in silence, in admitting fear, in speaking for the voiceless, in carrying the weight of memory. Today, his grave at Arlington is second only to President John F. Kennedy's in number of visitors. Thousands still come each year to stand before the simple white stone and whisper thanks. The final reflection. Audie Murphy never asked to be a hero. He never sought the spotlight, the fame, the medals, or the movies. He was a farm boy who answered his country's call. A soldier who refused to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. A man who faced death countless times, and who lived with its shadow long after the guns went silent. In the burning fields of Holtzwihr, he showed the world the impossible. In the quiet decades that followed, he showed the world the cost. Audie Murphy's life was not just a war story. It was the story of America itself, of struggle, sacrifice, triumph, and pain. And though he left us far too soon, his legacy endures, not as myth, but as memory. The boy from Texas who became a soldier, the soldier who became a hero, and the hero who never stopped being human. Time has a way of turning men into myths, but Audie Murphy's story resists myth. Because his courage, his pain, his triumphs, and his struggles were real. He wasn't a Hollywood creation, though Hollywood tried to capture him. He wasn't a propaganda symbol, though the army celebrated him. He was simply a soldier who answered when history called, and whose name became a symbol for an entire generation. The measure of courage. Historians often ask, what made Audie Murphy different? Was it his size? Unlikely. He was barely 5 feet 5 inches and 110 pounds when he enlisted. Was it his training? Not especially. Thousands trained just as he did. Was it opportunity? In part, circumstances thrust him into impossible situations. But what set him apart was not what he carried in his hands, but what he carried in his heart. An unshakable refusal to give up. A loyalty to his men that went beyond reason. A quiet, stubborn determination to stand his ground no matter the odds. Murphy once said, "The real heroes are the men who never came back." That humility defined him. And yet, to those who survived because of him, there was no question. Murphy himself was the embodiment of courage, the symbol of the citizen soldier. In many ways, Murphy represented the citizen soldier ideal. He was not a career officer, not born into military tradition, not groomed for greatness. He was a farm boy, raised in poverty, who went to war out of necessity. That made his story relatable to millions of Americans. Because if Murphy could rise from nothing and face down tanks alone, then perhaps courage lived in every man, waiting for the moment to be tested. In Murphy, the nation saw itself. Ordinary, unpolished, imperfect, but when the time came, capable of extraordinary deeds. The cost of greatness. But Murphy's story also carried a warning. Heroism on the battlefield often comes with invisible wounds. Behind every medal was a scar. Behind every photograph, a sleepless night. The boy who became a legend never truly escaped the war. And in that truth lies perhaps his greatest lesson. That courage is not the absence of fear or pain, but the decision to live with both and keep moving forward. Hollywood's Shadow. The film To Hell and Back brought Murphy's legend to millions. It cemented his image as the fearless warrior, the man who could not be stopped. But it also cast a long shadow. Audiences saw the hero, not the haunted man. They saw the battlefield victories, not the battles he fought alone in the dark of night. Murphy bore that weight silently. He smiled for cameras, signed posters, and played roles. But he knew that the man on the screen was only half the story. And yet, perhaps that was necessary. For a nation still healing from war, Murphy became a symbol of hope, of triumph, of resilience. The enduring inspiration. Today, soldiers still study Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr. Military academies teach it as an example of defensive genius, of leadership under fire, of the power of one man's determination. But beyond tactics, Murphy's story continues to inspire because it reminds us that greatness is born not from privilege, but from perseverance. His legacy lives in veterans who see in him their own struggles with trauma. It lives in young Americans who read his story and realize that even the smallest among us can stand tall when history demands it. It lives in every visitor who kneels at his grave, whispering thanks for courage that shaped a generation. The legend grows. Decades after his death, Murphy's legend has only grown. In 1996, the U.S. Postal Service honored him with a commemorative stamp. In Texas, highways bear his name. Schools and monuments remember him. At Arlington National Cemetery, his grave remains one of the most visited in the nation, second only to President Kennedy's. Visitors leave flags, medals, flowers, even notes of gratitude. Some are veterans who survived their own battles. Some are children learning his story for the first time. All are drawn by the same truth, that Murphy's life, though short, carried a weight far greater than his years. What Audie Murphy means today. In an age where wars are remembered more through movies than memories, Audie Murphy's story bridges the gap between history and humanity. He reminds us that war is not just strategy and statistics, but flesh and blood, young men thrown into chaos, making choices that shape nations. He reminds us that heroism is complicated, that the bravest among us may also be the most wounded, that medals can shine brightly while the soul beneath them suffers quietly. And he reminds us that every generation must decide what it values most: power or principle, comfort or courage. Perhaps the best way to understand Audie Murphy is to return to that cold January morning in Holtzwihr. The odds were hopeless, the enemy overwhelming, the outcome certain. And yet, Murphy climbed onto that burning tank, braced behind the .50 caliber machine gun, and said with his actions what words could never capture. Not here. Not today. That stand was not just about a battlefield. It was about the human spirit, about refusing to yield, even when the world says you must. And that is why, half a century later, his story still matters. Not as a tale of guns and glory, but as a reminder of what courage looks like when everything else has been stripped away.